He signed the divorce papers while she was still unconscious on the operating table. Her triplets were fighting for their lives in plastic incubators. He canceled her insurance, locked her out of the hospital, and walked away without looking back. He thought he had erased her completely. What he did not know, the woman he just threw away was about to inherit a $400 million empire. And she remembered exactly who she was before she met him. This is not a story about a victim. This is a story about a woman who refused to stay broken. If stories like this move you, hit subscribe and stay until the end. Trust me, you will not see this satisfying ending coming. The hospital hallway smelled of antiseptic and fear. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished floor where Preston Holloway stood adjusting his cufflinks. His tailored suit looked absurdly out of place at 3:47 in the morning. But Preston never appeared anywhere looking less than perfect. Image was everything. Control was everything. Behind the double doors marked intensive care unit. His wife lay unconscious. Meredith Caldwell Holloway had nearly died 2 hours ago. Emergency C-section, massive blood loss, 3 premature babies now fighting for their lives in plastic incubators, connected to machines that beeped and whirred and did the breathing their tiny lungs could not manage alone. Preston checked his watch. The attorney was late. A nurse emerged from the ICU, exhaustion carved into her face. She paused when she saw him standing there, something flickering in her eyes that might have been hope. "Mr. Holloway, your wife is stable but critical. The next 24 hours will be crucial. Would you like to see her?" Preston did not look up from his phone. "Not necessary." The nurse hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond to such coldness. "And the babies, they are in the NICU. 2 girls and a boy. They are small, but they are fighters." "I am aware." Preston's voice carried no warmth, no curiosity, no fear, just the flat efficiency of a man reviewing quarterly reports. The elevator doors opened at the end of the corridor. A thin man in a gray suit stepped out, leather briefcase in hand. Richard Sullivan, senior partner at Sullivan & Associates, had handled Preston's legal matters for 15 years. He had never been summoned to a hospital before. "Mr. Holloway," Richard approached with careful steps, lowering his voice. "Are you certain about this? The timing is rather unusual." Preston finally looked up, his blue eyes cold and clear. "The timing is perfect. She is unconscious. She cannot contest. I want this finalized before she wakes up." Richard opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. The documents inside had been prepared 3 weeks ago, long before Meredith went into labor. Preston had planned this moment with the same precision he applied to hostile takeovers. "Sign here, Chom," Richard pointed to the first line, "and here and initial each page." Preston took the Mont Blanc pen from his pocket and began signing. His signature was bold and confident, the strokes of a man who had never doubted himself. Each page turned brought him closer to freedom. No more complicated pregnancy. No more emotional wife slowing him down. No more weakness. The NICU was just down the hall. 3 incubators held 3 lives that shared his DNA. Preston did not spare them a glance. "What about insurance?" Richard asked quietly. "Mrs. Holloway's coverage is through your corporate policy." "Terminate it." Preston did not hesitate. "Effective immediately." Richard's pen paused. Even for him, this felt excessive. "The babies require extensive neonatal care. Without coverage, the hospital will likely reduce their priority status." "That is not my concern." Preston closed the folder and handed it back. "She wanted children. She can figure out how to pay for them." Richard tucked the documents away, his expression carefully neutral. He had represented criminals with more conscience than this. "The divorce will be finalized within hours. I will file electronically." "Good." Preston straightened his tie. "I have a board meeting at 9. The announcement needs to be controlled. Mutual separation, irreconcilable differences. No mention of the pregnancy complications. And if she speaks publicly." Preston smiled, the expression carrying no warmth. "She will not. She has no money, no family, and no credibility. By the time she understands what happened, I will have already written the story." His phone buzzed. A message from Sloan Whitmore lit the screen. "Is it done?" Preston typed back one word. "Yes." Sloan's response came immediately. "Perfect. I will have the press statement ready for your approval by 7. See you at the office. Preston pocketed the phone and turned toward the elevator. His leather shoes echoed against the floor as he walked away from the ICU, away from the NICU, away from the woman who had trusted him with everything. Behind him, machines continued to beep. 3 premature babies continued to fight, and Meredith Caldwell Holloway, her body broken and stitched together, lay unconscious and utterly alone. She did not know that her husband had just erased her. She did not know that her children were now legally fatherless. She did not know that the man she had given up her career for, the man she had trusted completely, had been planning this betrayal for months. But she would learn. Somewhere deep into the building, a monitor began to alarm. A nurse rushed towards one of the incubators, her voice sharp with urgency. We need support in here. Baby B is desatting. Preston stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. The doors closed on the chaos behind him. In the NICU, baby Charlotte gasped for air she could barely take. In the ICU, Meredith's eyes began to flutter beneath closed lids, consciousness slowly returning. And in a law office across Manhattan, documents were being filed that would change everything. Not just for Meredith, for Preston too, though he did not know it yet. Because the woman he had just discarded was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. Chapter 1 word count 892 words. Running total 892 words. Status under target. Expanding. The elevator descended in silence. Preston allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as the numbers dropped. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. Meredith had been useful once. A pretty face on his arm at charity events. A warm body in his bed. A potential connection to old money that never quite materialized the way he had hoped. But then came the pregnancy. Not 1 child, but 3. High risk from the beginning. Months of bed rest. Medical emergencies. Emotional outbursts. Preston did not do complications. His phone buzzed again as he reached the parking level. This time it was Marcus Webb, his chief financial officer. The investor meeting tomorrow has been moved to 9:30. Sloan said you would be available. Preston typed his confirmation as he approached his black Mercedes, already running with the driver waiting. He slid into the back seat and loosened his tie. Office, sir, the driver asked. No, the penthouse. I need to shower before the breakfast meeting. The car pulled into the empty Manhattan streets. Outside the window, the city was just beginning to wake. Delivery trucks rumbled past closed restaurants. Joggers appeared on sidewalks. The sun crept above the skyline, painting the glass towers gold. Preston thought about Meredith for exactly 4 seconds. She would wake up confused. She would cry. She would beg. Eventually, she would accept what everyone accepted when facing someone with his resources. She would disappear quietly, take whatever scraps he allowed, and raise those children in some forgettable apartment somewhere he would never have to see. He had already won. What Preston did not know, what he could not possibly know, was that Meredith Caldwell was not the helpless housewife he believed her to be. Before she met him, before she gave up everything to become his wife, she had been one of the sharpest forensic accountants in New York, and she was about to remember that. Meredith woke to the sound of alarm she did not recognize. Her body felt wrong, hollow, like something essential had been taken and not returned. For a moment, she could not remember where she was. The ceiling above her was white and unfamiliar. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and something metallic. Then the pain rushed back. She tried to sit up, but agony tore through her abdomen, forcing a gasp from her lips. Her hand flew to her stomach, flat, empty. The babies. Where were her babies? Easy. A nurse appeared at her side, pressing gentle hands against her shoulders. You have been through major surgery. You need to rest. My babies. Meredith's voice came out as a cracked whisper, raw from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. Where are my babies? Are they alive? The nurse's expression shifted, something complicated moving behind her eyes. They are in the NICU. 2 girls and a boy. They are very small, but they are stable for now. Relief flooded Meredith so quickly she felt dizzy. Tears slid down the sides of her face, soaking into the pillow. I need to see them. Please, I need to see them. There are some things we need to discuss first. The nurse looked toward the door, and Meredith noticed for the first time that someone else was waiting there. A man she had never seen before, holding a tablet instead of flowers. Mrs. Holloway. He stepped into the room with practiced efficiency. Actually, I should say Miss Caldwell now. The correction landed like a physical blow. Meredith stared at him, certain she had misheard. What did you say? There has been a change to your marital status. The man's voice was flat, professional, utterly devoid of compassion. Your divorce was finalized at approximately 4:15 this morning. Meredith's heart began to pound. That is not possible. I was unconscious. Yes. He turned the tablet toward her, and she saw the documents glowing on the screen. Preston's signature, bold and familiar. Her own name printed beneath it, authorized by legal proxy, executed without her knowledge. But the paperwork was valid. Your husband, your former husband, filed for emergency dissolution, citing irreconcilable differences. The room began to spin. Meredith gripped the bed rails, knuckles turning white. He cannot do that. I did not agree to anything. The documents suggest otherwise. The administrator scrolled through the pages. Additionally, I need to inform you that your medical coverage has been terminated. You are no longer listed on Mr. Holloway's corporate insurance policy. What about my children? Meredith's voice rose, panic clawing at her chest. They are premature. They need machines. They need doctors. NICU care is extraordinarily expensive. The man's tone did not change. Without insurance coverage, we will need to discuss alternative payment arrangements. Meredith felt something crack inside her. Not her body this time. Something deeper. Those are my children. You cannot deny them care because of money. No one is denying care. Miss Caldwell, we are simply clarifying financial responsibility. He tucked the tablet under his arm. A billing coordinator will visit you later today. In the meantime, I should mention that your room has been reassigned. We will be moving you to the general postpartum ward within the hour. He left without waiting for a response. The nurse remained, but she would not meet Meredith's eyes. I want to see my husband. Meredith heard herself say the words, even as she knew they were useless. I want to see Preston. Now. The nurse finally looked at her, something like pity in her expression. Ms. Caldwell, he is not coming. Then I will go to him. Meredith threw back the blanket, ignoring the scream of her stitches. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and tried to stand. Her knees buckled immediately. She collapsed against the mattress, pain exploding through her core. Please. The nurse helped her back into bed. You cannot walk yet. Your body needs time to heal. I do not have time. Meredith was crying now. Ugly sobs that shook her broken body. He is taking everything. He is taking my children. The nurse said nothing. There was nothing to say. 2 hours later, Meredith was wheeled through the hospital on a gurney, past the NICU where her babies lay in plastic boxes, past families celebrating new life, past everything she had imagined her first day of motherhood would be. They put her in a room with no windows, thin blankets, and a view of a parking garage. Her phone showed $47 in her personal account. Preston had closed their joint accounts. Her credit cards had been canceled. Every message she sent to his number bounced back undelivered. She was divorced, uninsured, and legally powerless. But as Meredith lay in that cold room, staring at the ceiling, something else began to stir beneath the grief. Something she had buried for 3 years beneath the role of supportive wife. She was not helpless. She had never been helpless. She had simply forgotten who she was. Meredith reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through old contacts, searching for a name she had not called in years. Garrett Sullivan, investigative journalist, her friend from college, back when she was still Meredith Caldwell, forensic accountant, the woman who could find hidden money in any balance sheet. She pressed call. Hello? The voice on the other end was sleepy, confused. It was barely 6 in the morning. Garrett, Meredith's voice steadied. It is Meredith. I need help, and I need you to not publish anything. Yet. Garrett Sullivan arrived at the hospital 3 hours later, laptop bag over his shoulder and a cup of coffee in each hand. He looked exactly as Meredith remembered. Rumpled jacket, curious eyes, the permanent expression of someone always chasing a story. You look terrible. He handed her one of the coffees and sat down in the plastic chair beside her bed. And I mean that with complete affection. Meredith almost smiled, almost. I gave birth to triplets yesterday, was divorced while unconscious, and am now apparently homeless. I think terrible is generous. Garrett's expression shifted from friendly to serious in an instant. Tell me everything. So she did. The emergency surgery, the documents signed without her consent, the insurance cancellation, the room downgrade, the threat to her children's care. As she spoke, Garrett's jaw tightened progressively, his journalist instincts clearly activating. I have been investigating Holloway Ventures for almost 2 years, he said when she finished. Something has never added up about their financials. They expanded too fast, acquired too many companies. The debt ratios in this public filings do not match their growth pattern. Meredith sat up straighter, ignoring the pull of her stitches. I used to be a forensic accountant. Before I met him, before I became... She paused, swallowing the bitterness. Before I gave that up. I remember. Garrett opened his laptop. You were one of the best. That is exactly why I need you to look at this. He turned the screen toward her. SEC filings, quarterly reports. The kind of documents she used to dissect for breakfast. Meredith's eyes moved across the numbers. And within seconds, the old instincts came flooding back. This expansion rate is unsustainable, she said, pointing to a column of figures. They would need external capital injection every 18 months just to service the existing debt. But there is no record of bridge financing anywhere. Which means either they have a hidden revenue source or they are hiding significant liabilities. Meredith's mind was working now, the fog of grief temporarily lifted by the familiar clarity of analysis. He is in trouble, real trouble. That is why he divorced me. Garrett frowned. I do not follow. Investors do not like instability. A complicated pregnancy with triplets, a wife in and out of hospitals, potential custody issues down the road. Meredith saw it clearly now, the pattern emerging from the chaos. He was removing variables, making himself look stable and decisive for whoever is about to give him money. There is a major funding round that's scheduled for next month, Garrett confirmed. Rumor is it is make or break for the company. A knock at the door interrupted them. A woman in a white coat entered, her expression serious but kind. She was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the steady gaze of someone who had seen too much suffering to be fazed by it. Ms. Caldwell, I am Dr. Catherine Hale. I oversee the NICU. Meredith's heart lurched. My babies, are they okay? They are stable? Dr. Hale closed the door behind her and lowered her voice. But I am not here about their medical status. I am here because I have been documenting some irregularities in how your case is being handled. Garrett and Meredith exchanged glances. What kind of irregularities? Meredith asked. Dr. Hale sat on the edge of the bed, her voice barely above a whisper. The pressure to reduce care priority the moment your insurance was terminated. The speed with which your room was reassigned. The conversations I overheard between administrators about managing the Holloway situation. She reached into her pocket and produced a USB drive. I have been in medicine for 30 years. I know when someone powerful is pulling strings, and I will not let children suffer because of adult cruelty. Meredith took the drive with trembling fingers. Why are you helping me? Because those are 3 innocent babies in my NICU. Dr. Hale's eyes hardened. And because I have seen men like your ex-husband before, they believe money makes them untouchable. Someone needs to prove them wrong. After the doctor left, Garrett plugged the USB into his laptop. The files inside were comprehensive. Time-stamped emails, recorded phone calls, a paper trail of every decision made regarding Meredith's care from the moment Preston signed the divorce papers. This is ammunition, Garrett said quietly. But it is not enough to take him down. We need to find out what he is really hiding. Meredith stared at the screen, her mind racing. She was weak. She was broken. She had nothing except a phone with a dying battery and $47 to her name. But she also had something Preston did not know about. Skills he had forgotten she possessed. A network he thought she had abandoned. And now she had evidence. He made a mistake, Meredith said slowly. He assumed I would fall apart. He assumed I would disappear quietly. And instead, Meredith met Garrett's eyes, and for the first time since she woke up in this nightmare, She felt something besides despair. She felt fury. Instead, I am going to find out exactly how much trouble he is really in, and then I am going to make sure the right people know about it. Chapter 3, word count 924 words. Running total 3026 words. Status under target, expanding. That afternoon, a letter arrived at the hospital. It had been forwarded from Meredith's old address, the apartment she had lived in before Preston swept her into his world of penthouses and promises. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, bearing the letterhead of a law firm she did not recognize. Garrett watched as she opened it, his expression curious. "What is it?" Meredith scanned the first paragraph, then read it again more slowly. The words did not make sense. "It is about my father's estate. Your father passed away years ago. Did he not? 8 years ago." Meredith flipped to the second page, her confusion deepening. "There was nothing to inherit. He was a history professor. He left me some books and a few $1,000s. But the letter said something different. The letter spoke of trusts and holdings and verification periods. It referenced her grandmother's name, a woman Meredith had barely known, and legal proceedings that had apparently been ongoing for over a decade. "Garrett," Meredith's voice was strange, distant. "This says I need to contact them immediately regarding the activation of beneficiary status." "Activation of what?" Meredith looked up from the letter, her face pale. "I do not know, but apparently my grandmother built something called the Caldwell Trust, and apparently I am the sole surviving beneficiary." She reached for her phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the page. Whatever this was, it could not be a coincidence. Not now, not when everything else was falling apart. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. "Marsh & Associates, how may I direct your call? My name is Meredith Caldwell." She gripped the letter tightly. "I received a letter about an estate matter. I need to speak with someone immediately." "One moment. Ms. Caldwell. Mr. Marsh has been expecting your call." Theodore Marsh was a man who spoke in measured sentences and never smiled unless absolutely necessary. He met Meredith in a private conference room 3 days after her discharge, when she could finally walk without assistance and had secured a temporary studio apartment using the small emergency fund Garrett had loaned her. "Your grandmother, Eleanor Caldwell, was a remarkable woman." Theodore laid a folder on the table between them. "She built a private equity portfolio over 50 years that is now worth approximately $400 million. Meredith felt the room tilt slightly. "That is not possible. No one ever told me. My mother never mentioned anything about money." "Your mother blocked all communications regarding the trust." Theodore's voice remained neutral, but his eyes betrayed something like sympathy. "She and your grandmother had a difficult relationship. When Eleanor passed away 12 years ago, your mother contested the inheritance. The legal battle has been ongoing ever since. Then why contact me now?" Theodore opened the folder and pointed to a highlighted paragraph. "The trust contains an unusual clause. It activates fully only upon the birth of multiple heirs to the Caldwell line. Your triplets triggered that clause. As of 3 days ago, you are the sole controlling beneficiary." Meredith stared at the numbers on the page. $400 million. Enough to secure her children's future forever. Enough to fight Preston with his own weapons. Enough to rebuild everything he had torn apart. "There is a complication," Theodore continued. "The trust requires a 90-day verification period before funds become accessible. During that time, you have legal protection as a beneficiary, but no liquid access to assets." 90 days. Meredith did the math quickly. 3 months of survival on almost nothing while her ex-husband controlled the narrative. "I know it seems like an eternity." Theodore closed the folder. "But this protection status is significant. Any actions taken against a verified trust beneficiary during the review period can be classified as financial coercion. Your ex-husband's behavior, the insurance cancellation, the custody threats, all of it becomes legally problematic." For the first time in days, Meredith felt something like hope. "So he cannot hurt me without consequences. He can still hurt you, but now there will be a record, and when the 90 days are complete, you will have the resources to make him answer for every single decision." Meredith left the meeting feeling lighter than she had since waking up in that hospital room. She called Garrett immediately. "It is real," she told him. "The trust is real. I just need to survive 3 months." Then we need to be smart. Garrett's voice crackled through the phone. I published an anonymous tip about Holloway Ventures' debt exposure this morning. Nothing definitive, just questions. Their stock dropped 3% within an hour. He will know it came from you. He will suspect. He cannot prove anything. And right now, suspicion is enough to make his investors nervous. That evening, Meredith received word that her emergency motion had been accepted by the family court. A hearing was scheduled for the following week to review the restraining order Preston had filed. She prepared her documents carefully, organizing the hospital records, the timeline of events. Doctor, Hale's evidence. For 3 days, everything seemed to be moving in her direction. The babies grew stronger. Charlotte gained 2 ounces. Sophie and James were breathing better. The court date approached, and Meredith allowed herself to believe, for just a moment, that she might actually win. Then Preston struck back. She was at the hospital, standing outside the NICU glass, when a security guard approached her. Ms. Caldwell, his voice was apologetic but firm. I need to ask you to come with me. What is happening? Meredith felt the familiar cold dread spreading through her chest. I have permission to be here. I have supervised visiting rights. There has been an update to your case. The guard would not meet her eyes. An emergency protective order was filed this morning. You are not permitted in the NICU until further notice. Meredith's knees buckled. She grabbed the wall for support. A protective order against me for my own children. I am sorry, ma'am. I am just following instructions. They escorted her out of the hospital. At the exit, a woman in an expensive suit was waiting, a document folder in her manicured hands. Ms. Caldwell. The woman's smile was cold. I am Margaret Foster, representing Mr. Holloway. This is a copy of the emergency motion filed this morning, citing maternal instability and potential endangerment. The notes found on your phone describing alleged conspiracies against your husband were presented as evidence of delusional thinking. Meredith felt the blood drain from her face. Her notes, the documentation she had been keeping to protect herself, twisted into proof of insanity. This is not over, she said, her voice shaking. Margaret's smile widened. Miss Caldwell, it was over the moment you thought you could outmaneuver a man like Preston Holloway. He has more lawyers, more money, and more patience than you could ever imagine. My advice, accept whatever settlement he offers and disappear, for your own sake. The woman walked away, leaving Meredith standing on the sidewalk, locked out of her children's hospital, watching her false victory crumble into dust. Chapter 4. Word count 929 words. Running total 498 words. Status under target. Expanding on. Rain began to fall as Meredith stood frozen on the sidewalk. The drops were cold against her face, mixing with tears she could not control. Inside that building, her babies were growing without her. Charlotte, Sophie, James, 3 names she had chosen alone in her hospital bed, whispering them like prayers. Now she could not even touch them. Her phone buzzed. A text from Garrett. Saw the news. Preston's PR team leaked a story. They are painting you as unstable. Do not respond publicly. Meredith's hands shook as she typed back. He is using my own evidence against me. The notes I kept to protect myself. He turned them into proof that I am crazy. Garrett's response came immediately. Come to my apartment. We need to regroup. But as Meredith turned to leave, another message appeared on her screen. Unknown number. The words made her stop breathing. Miss Caldwell, this is Dorothy, your mother. We need to talk about what you do not know. Meredith stared at the message. She had not spoken to her mother in 6 years, not since her father's funeral. When Dorothy had looked at her with cold eyes and said that Meredith had always been too trusting for her own good. At the time, Meredith had thought it was grief talking. Now she wondered if it had been a warning. She typed back 3 words. Where and when. The response was an address in Connecticut, the Caldwell estate, the house Meredith had visited only twice in her entire life. Tomorrow morning. Come alone. Whatever secrets her mother had been keeping, Meredith was about to learn them all, and she had a terrible feeling that the truth would be worse than anything she had imagined. The Caldwell estate sat at the end of a winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. The house itself was imposing rather than welcoming, all gray stone and tall windows that reflected the overcast sky. Meredith had forgotten how cold this place felt. even in sunlight. Dorothy Caldwell was waiting on the front steps. She looked exactly as Meredith remembered. Silver hair pulled back severely. Expensive clothes that somehow conveyed disapproval. The face of a woman who had never learned how to express warmth. "You look like death," Dorothy said by way of greeting. "I suppose that is understandable, given the circumstances." Meredith did not rise to the bait. "You said we needed to talk. So talk." Dorothy turned and walked into the house without responding. Meredith followed, past portraits of ancestors she had never known, through rooms filled with antiques she had never been allowed to touch. They ended up in a study at the back of the house, where a fire crackled despite the mild weather. "Sit." Dorothy gestured to a leather chair. She remained standing, one hand resting on the mantel. "I assume the lawyer has told you about the trust." "He told me enough. $400 million, a 90-day waiting period. You blocked communications for 12 years. Meredith kept her voice steady. "What he did not tell me is why." Dorothy was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was harder than Meredith had ever heard it. "I blocked communications because I was protecting you. That money destroyed my mother. It destroyed my marriage. I did not want it to destroy you too." "Protecting me," Meredith laughed bitterly. "I have been divorced, bankrupted, and separated from my children. If this is protection, I would hate to see neglect." "You married Preston Holloway." Dorothy's eyes flashed. "That was never supposed to happen. He was never supposed to find you." The words hung in the air, strange and ominous. Meredith felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. "What do you mean, find me?" Dorothy walked to a cabinet and removed a folder. Inside were photographs, documents, reports. She spread them across the desk with careful precision. "Preston Holloway hired a private investigator 4 years ago, before you ever met. He was looking for potential trust beneficiaries, old money targets for strategic marriages." Meredith stared at the photographs. One showed Preston meeting with a man in a gray suit, exchanging an envelope. The timestamp was dated 6 months before their first encounter at that charity gala. The one she had always believed was chance. "He knew about the trust before he met me." The words came out hollow, mechanical. "Our entire relationship was planned. The pregnancy complicated things." Dorothy's voice was clinical, detached. "Triplets meant the trust would activate and you would gain control. Not him, not through marriage. You personally, that is why he divorced you so quickly. He was trying to distance himself before the activation." Meredith felt sick. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of believing she was loved, valued, protected. 3 years of giving up everything she was to become everything he wanted. And all of it had been a lie. Why did he not just wait? Meredith forced herself to think logically, even as her heart shattered. Why divorce me at all if he stayed married? He would have had access through community property. Because the trust has specific provisions against spousal access during the first 5 years of activation. Dorothy sat down across from her daughter. Eleanor was not a fool. She knew men would try to marry into the money. She built safeguards. So he could never have gotten the money anyway. Not directly, but he could have leveraged your position, used your name, borrowed against anticipated inheritance. Dorothy leaned forward. He panicked when the triplets were born. 3 babies meant immediate activation. He signed the divorce papers the moment he realized the money would be yours alone. Meredith buried her face in her hands. Everything she thought she understood about her life was wrong. Her marriage, her choices, her identity. "There is more," Dorothy said quietly. "Something even the lawyer does not know." Meredith looked up, exhausted beyond words. "What else could there possibly be?" "Your father," but Dorothy's voice cracked for the first time. "Harold, he was not who you thought either." The room seemed to contract around Meredith. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that your father married me for the same reason Preston married you. He was a fortune hunter, a charming man with a beautiful smile and absolutely no conscience." Dorothy's eyes glistened with old pain. "I found out 10 years into our marriage. It destroyed everything between us. That is why I blocked the trust communications. That is why I tried to keep you away from this money. Dad loved me." Meredith's voice was a whisper. "He taught me everything. He was the only person who ever believed in me. He loved you. Dorothy agreed. That much was real. But the man you knew as your devoted father was also the man who spent 15 years trying to break my mother's trust through legal manipulation. He died before he succeeded. I have been cleaning up his mess ever since. Meredith stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I need to leave. Wait. Dorothy reached out, an uncharacteristic gesture. I can help you access the trust faster. There are emergency provisions, but you would need to sign over 60% to a family preservation fund, one that I control. Meredith stared at her mother, this woman who had abandoned her emotionally for years, who had kept secrets that might have saved her from Preston, who was now, in this moment, trying to take advantage of her desperation. Everyone wants to own me, Meredith said slowly. You, Preston. Everyone sees me as a bank vault instead of a person. She walked toward the door. Where are you going? Dorothy called after her. You cannot survive this alone. Boom, Meredith paused at the threshold. Watch me. She was halfway down the driveway when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Catherine Hale. Meredith answered with trembling fingers. Meredith, the doctor's voice was strained. You need to get to the hospital. Now. It is Sophie. Sophie's oxygen levels had dropped without warning. The alarms had been screaming for 40 minutes before they stabilized her. By the time Meredith reached the hospital, her smallest daughter was breathing again, but barely. She is a fighter, Dr. Hale said, meeting Meredith in the hallway since she still could not enter the NICU. But her lungs are developing slower than her siblings. She may need surgery if this happens again. Meredith pressed her hand against the glass, watching Sophie's tiny chest rise and fall. How much would surgery cost? Without insurance. Dr. Hale hesitated. $200,000. Minimum. The number felt abstract, impossible. Meredith had 47 days left before the trust became accessible. Sophie might not have 47 days, but the immediate crisis had brought an unexpected development. The hospital ethics board, reviewing the case after Dr. Hale's wrongful termination claim, had pressured the administration to temporarily restore Meredith's visiting privileges pending the custody hearing. It was a small victory, but after so many losses, it felt enormous. The hearing came 2 weeks later. Meredith arrived at the courthouse with her public defender, a tired but determined woman named Susan Chen, who had taken the case pro bono after reading about it in Garrett's latest article. The judge is fair, Susan told her as they waited outside the courtroom. Patricia Brennan does not like men who use children as weapons. Just stay calm, present the facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. Preston was already inside when they entered. He sat at the defendant's table in an immaculate suit, flanked by 2 attorneys in equally expensive attire. He did not look at Meredith as she took her seat. Margaret Foster presented Preston's case first. She painted a picture of a concerned father trying to protect his children from an unstable mother. She referenced the notes on Meredith's phone, the alleged paranoid behavior, the fact that Meredith had been consulting with a journalist instead of seeking professional help. Then it was Meredith's turn. She did not speak emotionally. She did not cry or plead. Instead, she presented her evidence the way she had once presented forensic analysis in corporate cases. Clear, methodical, devastating. The hospital records showing the speed of the insurance cancellation. The time-stamped documents proving the divorce had been prepared weeks before the surgery. The communications Dr. Hale had collected showing administrative pressure to reduce care for the Caldwell babies. And finally, the SEC filings she and Garrett had been analyzing for weeks, not as proof of guilt, but as context. Pattern recognition that suggested her ex-husband's motivations were financial, rather than paternal. I am not asking the court to believe my ex-husband is a criminal, Meredith concluded. I am asking the court to recognize that his actions were strategic, not protective. He did not file for divorce because I was unstable. He filed because my children triggered an inheritance he did not want me to control. Judge Patricia Brennan studied the documents for a long moment. Her face revealed nothing. I am inclined to lift the emergency restriction, she said finally. Miss Caldwell has demonstrated no threat to her children. On the contrary, the evidence suggests she has been systematically disadvantaged by her former spouse. Meredith felt relief flood through her. Finally, something going right. However, as the judge held up a hand, this is a preliminary ruling. A full custody evaluation will be conducted over the next 30 days. Both parties will submit to psychological assessments. Final determination will be made at the conclusion of that period. It was not total victory, but it was enough. Meredith would have access to her children again. She would have time to build her case. She would survive. After the hearing, she walked out of the courthouse into the sunshine, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Garrett was waiting on the steps with a genuine smile. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it. It is not over yet." But Meredith was smiling too. "We still have to prove what he is really hiding." Her phone buzzed. A news alert. She opened it without thinking, expecting some generic headline about markets or politics. Instead, she saw her own face staring back at her. "Troubled mother fights for custody after mental breakdown." The headline screamed across the screen. Below it, photographs she had never seen before. Her at her worst in the hospital, disheveled and crying. Screenshots of her notes, framed as evidence of paranoia. A statement from an anonymous hospital source claiming she had threatened staff. Sloan Whitmore had been busy. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Every outlet that had ignored her case was now covering it with gleeful sensationalism. Her name became a trending topic, not for her courage, but for her alleged instability. That night, Preston held a press conference. "I take no pleasure in this situation," he said, looking directly into the cameras with practiced sincerity. "My ex-wife is unwell. She needs help, not headlines. I am fighting for my children's safety. Nothing more." Sloan stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. The picture of a supportive partner, the replacement wife already being positioned for public acceptance. Meredith watched the broadcast from a homeless shelter. Her landlord had seen the news coverage and terminated her lease, citing concerns about bringing trouble to the building. She had nowhere else to go. Everything she had won in that courtroom had been erased in a single news cycle. The truth did not matter when Preston controlled the narrative. She curled up on a thin mattress in a room full of strangers and stared at the ceiling. 3 babies in a hospital, 1 needing surgery she could not afford, 30 days until the evaluation, 47 days until the trust, and Preston Holloway, smiling into cameras, already declaring victory. The first catastrophe came without warning. Meredith was at the hospital for her scheduled visitation when Charlotte's monitors began screaming. One moment, her daughter was sleeping peacefully in the incubator. The next, nurses were running, doctors were shouting, and Meredith was being pushed back behind a glass wall she was not allowed to cross. She watched helplessly as they worked on her daughter, chest compressions on a body smaller than both her hands, tubes being inserted into the lungs that could not function alone. The organized chaos of professionals fighting against death. It took 12 minutes to stabilize Charlotte, 12 minutes that felt like 12 years. Her lungs collapsed partially. Dr. Hale explained afterward, her face gray with exhaustion. "She needs surgery. Without it, this will happen again, and next time we might not be able to bring her back." "How long do I have?" Meredith's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "Days, maybe a week at most." The surgery would cost $280,000. Meredith had no insurance, no credit, and no access to the trust for another 43 days. She called Theodore Marsh in desperation, begging for emergency access to the funds. "The trust provisions are explicit," Theodore said, genuine regret in his voice. "Medical emergencies qualify for expedited review, but the minimum processing time is still 30 days. I have filed the request, but I cannot promise it will be approved in time." 30 days. Charlotte might not survive 30 days. The second catastrophe struck that same afternoon. Meredith had been working from public library computers, rebuilding her evidence files after the original documents were seized. She had copies of everything on a secondary drive, hidden in a locker at the bus station. It was not elegant, but it was secure, or so she thought. When she arrived at the bus station, the locker was empty, not broken into, opened with a key she had never shared. Her phone rang, Garrett's number. "Mara, my apartment was broken into last night." His voice was tight with controlled anger. "They took everything. External drives, backup files, notes, all of it." "The USB from Dr. Hale," Meredith said, her heart sinking. "Please tell me you have a copy somewhere." Silence. Then, "I did. On the drives they took." Meredith closed her eyes. Every piece of evidence she had collected, every document that proved Preston's calculated cruelty, gone. It gets worse, Garrett continued. I just got off the phone with Dr. Hale. She was fired this morning. Hospital security confiscated everything from her office, including any copies she might have had. He bought someone at the hospital. Meredith felt the walls closing in. He bought everyone. The third catastrophe arrived 2 hours later. Meredith was walking back to the shelter when she noticed the police car. Two officers stepped out, their faces professionally blank. Meredith Caldwell, the taller one, approached with his hand near his hip. You are under arrest for custodial interference and harassment. That is impossible. Meredith backed away instinctively. I have not done anything wrong. Mr. Holloway has filed a complaint. You have allegedly been stalking his business associates and illegally accessing proprietary company records. The officer produced handcuffs. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. This is manufactured. Meredith's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. He is making this up to silence me. You can explain that to the judge. The metal clicked around her wrists. Right now, you are coming with us. The news cameras were already waiting when they arrived at the precinct. Of course they were. Sloan had orchestrated every detail. Meredith walked past the flashing lights with her head down, knowing every image would be on every screen within the hour. The troubled mother had finally cracked. The narrative was complete. They put her in a holding cell with flickering lights and a toilet in the corner. No phone call for hours. No information about her children. Just cold concrete and the distant sound of other prisoners. Meredith sat on the metal bench and felt something inside her finally break. Not her will, not her determination, but the last fragile thread of hope she had been clinging to since this nightmare began. Charlotte was dying. Her evidence was destroyed. She was in jail. Preston had won. She pressed her palms against her eyes and let the tears come. Ugly, racking sobs that echoed off the concrete walls. She cried for her babies. She cried for the woman she used to be. She cried for the future that kept slipping further away. When the tears finally stopped, she was empty, hollow, finished. But then, in that emptiness, something else emerged. A memory. Her father's voice from years ago, teaching her to play chess in the study of their small house. When you are trapped, he had said, do not look for escape. Look for what your opponent is protecting. Meredith opened her eyes. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The cell was still cold, still gray, still hopeless. But her mind was working again. What was Preston protecting? Not his reputation. He had already sacrificed that for control. Not his money. That was already hemorrhaging. Not even his company. He was willing to burn it all down. The investors? He was protecting his access to investors. The funding round was his lifeline. Without it, everything collapsed. Meredith stood up slowly. She walked to the bars of her cell and waited. An hour later, she was granted her one phone call. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call Garrett. She called Caroline Webb. Caroline? Her voice was steady now, clear with purpose. It is Meredith. I know you know what Marcus did, and I know you hate him for it. The silence on the other end stretched long and heavy. Then Caroline Webb, wife of Preston Holloway's complicit CFO, said four words that changed everything. Tell me what you need. Caroline Webb had been married to Marcus for 11 years. She had known about his affair for 6 of them. She had stayed because of their children, because of financial security, because she had convinced herself that silent suffering was easier than public humiliation. Preston Holloway had been holding the affair over Marcus the entire time. Photographs, evidence from the threat of exposure that kept her husband compliant in every questionable decision the CEO demanded. I hate him, Carolyn said, sitting across from Meredith in the jail visitation room the next morning. Not just Preston, Marcus too, for being weak, for dragging our family into this. I am not asking Marcus to testify, Meredith explained. I know he cannot. The leverage Preston has on him is too strong. Then what do you want? I want Marcus to hesitate. Meredith leaned forward. Preston's funding round closes in 6 days. The final investor meeting is scheduled for Thursday. All I need is for Marcus to not show up. Carolyn frowned. That would destroy his career. His career is already destroyed. He just does not know it yet. Meredith's voice was calm, certain. When the truth comes out, and it will come out, Marcus can either be the man who helped cover up fraud or the man who stepped aside at the critical moment. One of those choices leads to prison. The other leads to a deal. The calculation moved behind Caroline's eyes. She had been a corporate lawyer before giving up her career for marriage, just like Meredith. She understood leverage. What about the money, Caroline asked. If Marcus walks away, we lose everything. You lose everything anyway when Preston falls. This way, you control the timing, you control the narrative, and your children's father becomes a cooperating witness instead of a defendant. Carolyn was silent for a long moment, then she nodded slowly. I will talk to him. No promises, but I will try. After Caroline left, Meredith made her second move. Theodore Marsh had posted her bail using the emergency legal provisions of the Caldwell Trust. It was not much, but it was enough to get her out of that cell. The trust emergency access request has been expedited, Theodore told her as she walked out of the precinct. Given the documented threat to the minor beneficiaries and the evidence of coordinated harassment, the board approved medical funding for Charlotte's surgery. Meredith stopped walking. They approved it 24 hours ago. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Theodore allowed himself a rare smile. Your daughter is going to live, Miss Caldwell. For the first time in weeks, Meredith felt something besides fear and fury. She felt gratitude, and she felt ready. The next 4 days moved quickly. Meredith worked from a motel room Garrett had secured under a false name. She did not need evidence anymore. She needed doubt. Garrett published his article on Tuesday. Not accusations, just questions. Concerns mount over Holloway Ventures, financial stability. He cited anonymous sources, industry analysts, the kind of careful reporting that could not be legally challenged, but planted seeds everywhere it landed. On Wednesday, Meredith reached out to 3 of Preston's largest investors directly. She introduced herself as a forensic accountant of the concerns about discrepancies in the company's reporting. She did not claim to have proof. She offered to share her analysis methodology. 2 of them declined the call. One listened for 20 minutes and asked thoughtful questions. That was enough. On Thursday morning, Marcus Webb did not show up to the final investor meeting. He sent a message citing a family emergency, but the real reason was sitting beside him in their Connecticut home. Caroline had delivered Meredith's message, and Marcus had finally understood the choice before him. The investors noticed the CFO's absence immediately. In a company already under scrutiny, missing leadership at a critical moment raised flags that could not be ignored. Sloan tried to fill the gap. She stepped into the meeting with her usual confidence, speaking about restructuring plans and growth projections. But she overreached. She mentioned details about asset transfers that were not in the public materials. What restructuring? The lead investor asked. This is the first we are hearing about asset movement. The meeting dissolved into questions Preston could not answer. By noon, the lead investor had called to announce that the funding round was being postponed pending clarification. By evening, Meredith received word that Charlotte's surgery had been successful. Her daughter was breathing on her own for the first time in her life. The tide had turned, but Meredith knew it was not over. Preston would fight. He always fought. The final confrontation was still coming. She just needed to be ready for it. Chapter 8, word count 803 words. Running total 8, 498 words. Status under target, expanding volume. That night, Meredith received an unexpected visitor at the motel. Dr. Catherine Hale arrived with a folder under her arm and determination in her eyes. I thought they fired you, Meredith said, stepping aside to let her in. They did, but they could not confiscate my personal email. Dr. Hale set the folder on the small desk. I sent copies of everything to my home computer before security arrived. I have been waiting for the right moment to share them. Inside the folder were documents Meredith had never seen, internal hospital communications about the Holloway babies, emails from administrators discussing how to handle the case, and, most importantly, a recorded phone call between a hospital executive and someone in Preston's legal team discussing how to minimize the institution's exposure if the babies died while coverage was being disputed. They were willing to let children die to avoid liability. Dr. Hale's voice shook with controlled rage. I have worked in medicine my entire life. I have never seen anything this calculated. Meredith stared at the documents. This was not just evidence of Preston's cruelty. This was evidence of criminal negligence involving the hospital itself. It changed everything. "Why are you giving this to me now?" Meredith asked. "Because I filed my wrongful termination lawsuit this morning." Dr. Hale met her eyes steadily. "It will create a news cycle. Questions will be asked. And when they are, I want to make sure the right people have the answers." Meredith felt the final pieces falling into place. Preston had built his fortress on the assumption that he controlled all the information. He had bought upon administrators and silenced witnesses and destroyed evidence. But he had forgotten about the doctor who had watched 3 babies fight for their lives while paperwork was prioritized over their care. "Thank you," Meredith said quietly. "Doctor." Hale shook her head. "Do not thank me. End him." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. Preston Holloway arrived expecting to manage the situation, to spin the narrative, to maintain control the way he always had. Instead, he walked into a room that was already full. Board members he had appointed, investors he had courted, legal counsel he had paid, and at the far end of the table, looking nothing like the broken woman he had left in that hospital hallway, sat Meredith Caldwell. "What is she doing here?" Preston's voice was sharp, but Meredith heard the crack beneath the surface. He was scared. "Ms. Caldwell is here at the board's invitation." The chairman, an older man named Douglas Harrison, gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit down, Mr. Holloway. We have matters to discuss." Preston remained standing. "This is absurd. She has no place in a corporate governance meeting. She has information we need." Douglas's voice was calm but unyielding. "Information that affects every person in this room." Meredith did not react to Preston's hostility. She simply opened the folder Dr. Hale had given her and began laying documents on the table with methodical precision. "I spent 3 years as a forensic accountant before I married Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice steady and professional. "I specialized in identifying patterns of financial irregularity in corporate structures. What I am about to share is not proof of criminal activity. It is a pattern that warrants independent verification." She walked them through the discrepancies she had identified. Debt ratios that did not match reported revenue. Shell companies with curious naming conventions. Asset transfers that coincided suspiciously with her divorce proceedings. "This is speculation," Preston interrupted. "You have no evidence." "I have patterns." Meredith did not look at him. She addressed the board directly. "I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to verify. Commission an independent audit. If I am wrong, you lose nothing except a few weeks of time. If I am right, you avoid being complicit in whatever this investigation eventually uncovers." The room was silent. Board members exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Preston's carefully constructed confidence was visibly cracking. Then Margaret Foster, his own attorney, spoke. "Mr. Holloway, I need to advise you that several of the claims Miss Caldwell has raised are already being examined by the SEC. We received notification this morning." Preston's face went white. "What notification?" "An inquiry based on patterns of insider trading and asset manipulation. The timeline aligns with your divorce proceedings." Margaret's voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes said something different. She was distancing herself. "I would recommend securing separate personal counsel." Preston turned to Sloan, who had been standing near the window. "Say something. Help me." Sloan was not there. While everyone focused on Meredith's presentation, Preston's mistress had slipped out of the room. She was already in a separate conference down the hall, negotiating her own immunity deal with investigators who had been waiting for someone inside to cooperate. "Where did she go?" Preston's voice cracked. "Where is Sloan?" "I believe she is prioritizing her own interests," Douglas said dryly. "Something I recommend everyone in this room consider carefully." The vote was swift. Preston Holloway was removed as CEO, effective immediately. An independent audit was authorized. All company assets were frozen pending the investigation's outcome. After the meeting, Preston caught Meredith in the hallway. His composure was gone. His face was red with fury and something else. Fear. "You destroyed everything," he snarled. Meredith stopped walking and turned to face him. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with exhaustion and clarity. "I did not destroy anything. You destroyed yourself." I just made sure the right people were watching. I made you. Preston stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. Without me, you were nothing. You would still be crunching numbers in some office. Invisible and ordinary. Meredith met his eyes without flinching. Without you, I forgot who I was. I gave up my career, my independence, my identity to become what you wanted. And you know what I learned, the woman I was before you was extraordinary. You just convinced me otherwise. She turned and walked away. Behind her, Preston Holloway stood alone in a hallway that had once belonged to him. Security guards were waiting to escort him from the building. His name would be removed from the door by morning. The man who had signed divorce papers over his unconscious wife's body had finally run out of moves. Chapter 9, word count 794 words. Running total 9,606 words. Status under target, expanding Wausau. 1 week later, the custody hearing reconvened. This time, the circumstances were dramatically different. Preston arrived without his team of expensive attorneys. Margaret Foster had resigned from his case, citing irreconcilable conflicts. His replacement was a harried public defender who had received the files only that morning. Judge Patricia Brennan reviewed the updated evidence with her characteristic thoroughness. The SEC inquiry, the board's removal of Preston, the hospital documents Dr. Hale had provided, now part of the official record. Mr. Holloway, the judge said finally, the pattern of behavior documented in these proceedings is deeply troubling. You terminated your wife's medical coverage while she lay unconscious. You filed for divorce without her knowledge or consent. You used your resources to manipulate custody proceedings and publicly defame the mother of your children. Preston said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Full custody is awarded to Miss Caldwell, Judge Brennan pronounced. Mr. Holloway is granted supervised visitation only, contingent upon completion of parental accountability counseling and pending the outcome of the federal investigation into his financial activities. Meredith closed her eyes. It was over. That evening, she held all three of her babies for the first time since they were born. Charlotte, post-surgery and healing beautifully. Sophie, growing stronger every day. James, watching her with curious eyes that seemed to understand more than any infant should. I am here now, she whispered to them. I am not going anywhere. Ever. 1 year later, Meredith stood at the window of her new apartment, watching the Manhattan skyline glow in the early morning light. The triplets were asleep in the next room, their breathing monitors silent for the first time in months. Charlotte no longer needed them. The past 12 months had been a slow process of reconstruction. The Caldwell Trust had activated fully, giving Meredith access to resources she had never imagined. But money, she had learned, could not heal everything. Charlotte still had permanent lung damage from those early weeks of neglected care. She would need ongoing treatment for years, possibly for life. The doctors were optimistic about her quality of life, but there would always be limitations. Meredith had given up pretending otherwise. Her relationship with Dorothy remained severed. After that day in Connecticut, Meredith had not returned her mother's calls. Some wounds were too deep to reconcile. Some truths were too painful to discuss. She had chosen independence over Dorothy's conditional support, and she did not regret the choice. But she grieved it sometimes. Late at night when the apartment was quiet and the city lights blurred through unexpected tears. Preston's trial was scheduled for the spring. The investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected. Fraud, embezzlement, securities violations. He was out on bail, living in a small apartment in New Jersey, waiting for a legal process that would likely end in prison. Meredith did not follow the news about him. She did not need to watch his destruction. Living well was revenge enough. Sloan Whitmore had cooperated with investigators in exchange for immunity. She had moved to Austin, taken a job at a startup, and disappeared from the society circles she had once craved. Not destroyed, just redirected. Meredith sometimes wondered if Sloan ever thought about the woman she had helped torment. Probably not. People like Sloan rarely looked backward. Garrett had published the full story after the court proceedings concluded. It won him a journalism award and a book deal. He and Meredith remained close friends, meeting for coffee once a week while the triplets played in his cramped apartment. There was no romance between them. Meredith had learned that she did not need another person to feel complete. She needed herself. Dr. Catherine Hale had won her wrongful termination lawsuit. The settlement was substantial. But more importantly, the publicity had forced systemic changes in how the hospital handled financially vulnerable patients. 3 other doctors had come forward with similar stories. A policy review was underway. Meredith had used part of her inheritance to establish something she called the Sophie Foundation, named after her daughter who had fought hardest to survive. The organization provided forensic accounting support to mothers in custody disputes. Women who were being financially manipulated by powerful partners could access expert analysis to trace hidden assets and document patterns of economic abuse. It was small work, quiet work, nothing like the dramatic courtroom confrontations she had survived. But every case she helped, every mother who gained custody, every child who stayed with the parent who actually wanted them, felt like a victory worth celebrating. The triplets stirred in the next room. Meredith heard Charlotte's distinctive cough, the one that would likely never fully disappear, followed by Sophie's responding whimper and James's grumpy protest at being woken. She walked to their room and stood in the doorway, watching them in the pale morning light. 3 small faces, 3 impossible survivors, 3 reasons to keep building. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, an unknown number. Meredith picked it up and saw a photograph of Preston at an airport, arm around a woman she did not recognize. A new target, probably another woman who would learn too late what kind of man she had chosen. The caption read, "Starting over. You have not seen the last of me." Meredith looked at the photograph for a long moment, then she deleted it. She lifted Charlotte from her crib, ignoring the twinge in her back from months of carrying babies through hospitals and courtrooms and shelters. Sophie reached up with grabbing hands, demanding equal attention. James watched from his corner, evaluating the situation with eyes too wise for his age. "Come on," Meredith said softly. "Breakfast time." She carried them to the kitchen, moving slowly because Charlotte tired easily and Sophie liked to pull a hair, and James had recently learned to kick. The apartment was not perfectly clean. The dishes from last night were still in the sink. The laundry pile had achieved concerning dimensions, but the sun was coming up. Her children were alive. And for the first time since she woke up in that hospital room, Meredith Caldwell felt genuinely free. Not because Preston was defeated, not because the money had arrived, not because the world finally believed her story. Free because she had remembered who she was. The forensic accountant who could trace any lie, the mother who would fight any battle, the woman who had survived being erased and emerged stronger than before. Preston Holloway had signed divorce papers over her unconscious body, convinced he was writing her out of his story. He never realized he was writing himself out of hers. Epilogue text. The Sophie Foundation has helped over 200 mothers in custody disputes. Preston Holloway's trial begins next spring. He faces up to 20 years in federal prison. Charlotte Caldwell took her first steps on her first birthday. Dr. Catherine Hale's testimony led to policy reforms affecting 3 major hospital systems. Meredith Caldwell recently testified before Congress about financial abuse in divorce proceedings. She did not mention Preston's name once. Chapter 10, word, count at 915 words. Running total 10, 849 words. Status slightly under target. Expanding final section. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. Washington in autumn. Leaves turning gold on the trees outside the congressional building. Meredith walked through the marble hallways in a simple blue dress. Nothing like the designer clothes Preston had once chosen for her. A young woman stopped her near the committee room door. "Ms. Caldwell, I just wanted to say thank you. Your foundation helped my sister last year. She got custody of her kids because of the financial analysis your team provided." Meredith smiled, genuine warmth spreading through her chest. "I am glad we could help. How is she doing, Tom?" "Better every day." The woman's eyes glistened. "She says you gave her hope when she had none left." After the woman walked away, Meredith stood alone for a moment in the hallway. A year ago, she had been standing in a different hallway, watching her ex-husband sign away her life. Now she was about to address Congress about protecting other women from the same fate. The journey between those 2 moments had nearly killed her. Some days, she still felt the weight of it, the fear, the loneliness, the desperate fight to survive. But she had survived, and that meant something. Meredith straightened her shoulders and walked into the committee room. Cameras flashed. Microphones waited. Representatives arranged themselves behind a curved desk. She took her seat, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. My name is Meredith Caldwell. 14 months ago, my husband divorced me while I lay unconscious after giving birth to triplets. He canceled my health insurance, froze my access to our finances, and used his resources to take my children from me. I am here today to ensure that no other mother experiences what I experienced. She did not mention Preston's name, not once, because in the end, this story was never about him. It was about her.